record this. Okay, so ah, okay. So I'll go through the beginning part of this lecture pretty quickly because we've already talked quite a bit about most of it. Uh, okay, it's trying to refresh. Okay. Okay, so you guys can still see it, right? There was a technical hiccup. Uh-oh, it's having trouble again. Okay, I'm gonna have to, and okay, so Emmett, can you see it now? Is everything, you can see the PowerPoint presentation and you can hear me? Okay, okay, great. Um, so the beginning part of this lecture is stuff we've already talked about, and it's just the idea that we're trying to explain the law of supply and explain why it is that when prices go up, that businesses are willing to produce more of a good or service. So why the supply curve slopes upward. And we said before that in order to really explain this, we have to have this idea of how firms operate. And in economics, the assumption is that all firms are operating to maximize their profits. So if the supply curve does slope upward, then it's going to be because firms are finding it more profitable to expand production when the price of the product goes up. Now, remember that profits are total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue is simply the amount that the firm receives from selling its output, and the costs are what the firm is going to pay for its inputs in the production process. And just to be clear, I mean, we've already talked about this too, but profits total revenue minus total cost. And we have to be kind of careful. The total revenue part is something we're going to be talking about over the course of the next coming weeks, almost up until the end of the semester. But right now, we're just going to focus in on the costs. And this is, again, picking up where we left off last time when we were talking about costs. And that is that the firm is overall has these costs of production that we call opportunity costs. And they can be broken down into the explicit costs, which you can think of as the accounting costs, the things that generate a cash flow that have receipts, and implicit costs that have to do with how the firm manages the assets of the business and can, by mismanaging them, actually increase the costs of doing business. So opportunity costs have explicit and implicit components. And so when economists are measuring profit, we said all firms are trying to maximize their profits. We're talking about this economic definition of profit as total revenue minus total costs that include the implicit costs of the firm. So a lot of students get confused, especially if you're a business student. There's this kind of warring definition of profit that economists have with accountants. And because accountants are interested in just tracking cash flows, then the way that accounting profit is measured is total revenue only minus the explicit costs. Because remember, again, the implicit costs don't generate any cash flows for the firm. So um, one of the things that we're going to talk about shortly is, meaning in like just another lecture or two, is that it's typical. And let's see, maybe I'll take just a moment to talk with somebody. And let's see. Beverly Casillas, are you here today?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Okay, good. So I'm going to tell you this and tell me if it sounds odd. Um, so economists predict that firms make a normal profit, which is zero. So the thing that I think might sound odd is that it's normal to earn zero profit. Does that sound weird to you?
Yeah, it does sound weird.
Yeah, right. And do you want to tell me what sounds kind of weird about it?
I mean, you'd expect to make more.
Yeah, like you wouldn't think that like and I say it's a normal profit, meaning that's typical, right, for like businesses. Um, but if you were like an investor and investors, they get part of the profit of the business. So if you were thinking about investing in a business and they said, we earned zero profit this year, you'd probably think that that wasn't a very good investment, right?
Right.
You think like maybe the business should close. But the reason why is that it's normal is because in economics, we're just measuring economic profit, not accounting profit. And I'm going to show you this next graph. Um, so accounting profit is what you normally hear about when you read a newspaper or a website or listen to the business news. You hear that Google earned, you know, so many hundreds of millions of dollars worth of profit, but they're just counting the revenue minus the explicit costs. So it's over on the right hand side. And you see how the accounting profit is like the big blue rectangle, Beverly?
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. So in economics, though, right, we have all of those explicit costs plus these implicit costs that don't have a receipt. So there's no cash flow, and the accountants don't recognize them. So economic profit's always going to be smaller than accounting profit. You see what I mean? Because
Hmm.
the costs are always bigger when we measure total opportunity costs. And that's what economists do. So when I say something like a business has earned zero economic profit, what that usually means, and this is something that you might want to write down or just stick a little note someplace, zero economic profit usually translates to about 7% accounting profit per year. And I say 7% because 7% is the long-term average of profitability for all major companies that you've seen like on the New York Stock Exchange or um, heard of like GM or um, I don't know, like Pepsi or Coke. Those companies over the long run earn about 7% accounting profit per year. So, so just to double check, Beverly, when I say 0% or zero economic profit, you hear 7% accounting profit. Now that doesn't sound so bad, does it?
No.
No, right? I mean that's like more like what we would expect. That's normal. But from the economist's point of view, that represents um, a zero economic profit because one of the implicit costs of investing in one business is not investing in another business. So part of our implicit costs include a normal rate of return from an accounting perspective. Because if you don't invest in GM, then you could take your money instead and invest in some other company, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so that's part of the cost of investing in one company is giving up the opportunity to invest in another. So so yeah, economists just have a kind of special way of thinking about profit. And it's important to know that, because otherwise you're going to hear things shortly that most business people would think are, nonsensical, like that it's normal to earn zero economic profit. And since this is economics, we're going to pretty shortly, we're going to stop saying economic profit, because it's supposed to be assumed that this is economics. So when we talk about profit, obviously we mean economic profit. Okay. So you follow me? Am I being
Yeah.
clear?
Yeah, that
Okay.
makes sense.
Okay. All right. So um, profit is total revenue minus total costs. Um, what do things look like? Well, one of the first things that we start to do when we're talking about this material is we want to be clear that costs are related to production, right? It's their inputs, or sometimes they call them factors of production. So we've got the factory cost, the cost of the factory, the cost of employing workers, and then we add those together and we get the total costs of the factory plus the workers. And then obviously when we employ workers, those workers are going to be used to produce output. And so you can see in the first column here, we have the number of workers we employ, and then how much output they can produce. In this case, it's cookies, right? One worker can produce 50 cookies, two workers can produce 90 cookies. So adding one more worker, the second worker produces an extra 40. And this third column, which is the marginal product of labor, this is a super important concept or word in economics, which is the word marginal. And marginal just means additional. So you should write that down somewhere, because you might get confused later on. So you can see that as we go from 0 to 1 workers, we get 50 additional, or our marginal product of labor is 50, and then our total amount of cookies is 50. If we go from 1 to 2 workers, the second worker helps us produce an additional 40 cookies, and then we get a total of 90 cookies. Okay, so I will um, ask Tom. Are you here this morning? Tom Chen?
Yeah, hello.
Yeah. So did you follow me about the marginal product, how to interpret it?
Sorry, I went to the restroom real quick. Can you?
Yeah. So the marginal product is just the additional output that each additional worker
Oh, okay.
brings. So if we go from 0 to 1 worker, our total output goes from 0 to 50, which means that first worker made 50 cookies,
Oh, okay.
right? And as we go from 1 to 2, we go from 50 to 90 cookies, which means that second worker made 40.
Mm-hmm.
Is that clear?
Uh, I think so. I think I got
Yeah.
it.
So the word marginal, the thing that I suggested is that when you hear the word marginal, because you won't really hear it in many other disciplines other than economics, you should think additional. It's a better, more transparent word, right? If I say the additional product, right, then it's of a worker.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary, do you have a mic? Because I didn't know. I
Yes.
just saw you had a chat question. Go ahead.
So yeah, I was asking if the economic profit, it's zero at equilibrium. What
Uh-huh.
happens when it's larger or like less than zero?
Well, that's a really good question, and we're going to answer it pretty quickly. But I can tell you just shortly, since you're curious, if firms earn less than zero economic profit, then normally they close down, they go bankrupt, they get out of business. And if they earn greater than zero profit, then we're not in equilibrium, and it normally encourages more investment in that business.
So then it will get to equilibrium.
Yeah, well, then those businesses with greater than zero economic profit expand.
Um,
So, like, I could give you a really good example, and that I don't know if you saw this when you were growing up or not, but Starbucks, right? When I was in grad school, Starbucks was just getting started. So this is like 20 years ago, right? And there were hardly any Starbucks, any like coffee shops. But Starbucks was very successful, and then they just spread, right? And that's because by very successful, they were making, a lot of profit, a lot more than most other companies, and that's why they were able to expand.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
sure. Okay, so and and Mary, I'll tell you one other thing, and that is you can be the watcher in chat because I can't have everything open all the time. So if you see another question in chat, just say something so I can respond to it. Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So okay. So this table, the main reason we're looking at this table is because we want to know that the costs are being driven by increased production. Because ultimately, we could graph this relationship between workers and output, so between inputs and outputs, and create what we call a production function. And we'll do that really quickly. And again, we can use the production function to illustrate a couple of things. One of them is this general idea of diminishing marginal product. And diminishing marginal product is just the idea that each additional unit of an input tends to bring less and less output than the units before it. So if we graph the production function for Hungry Helen's cookie factory, you can see the first worker, like as we noted, brings 50 units of output or 50 cookies. The second one brings an additional 40, so we go from 50 to 90 in terms of total. The third one is going to bring, it looks like, an additional 30 units worth of output. So we go from 90 to 120. And then the fourth worker only brings an additional 20 units. We go from 120 to 140. And the last worker, the fifth worker, just brings an additional 10 cookies. And so you see this production function has a slope that's decreasing. It bends over. And that's what a production function that exhibits diminishing marginal product looks like. And you might ask the question, and it's a good one, why is it that economists believe that most production functions exhibit diminishing marginal product? And the reason is that if you think about Hungry Helen's cookie factory case, she had a fixed factory and then added additional workers. So we're measuring the production function in terms of the number of units of a variable input, meaning the number of workers we can vary, while we're holding another input, which is the factory itself, fixed. So sometimes people talk about diminishing returns, which is returns is like output or whatever you're trying to get out of a production process, right? Diminishing returns to fixed factors of production, which means that in the case of Hungry Helen, the reason why she's getting less and less output per worker is because she has the same number of machines, the same amount of floor space. Eventually, right, each additional worker is going to create additional crowding. They won't have enough room, maybe all the tools and equipment they need to work with. Those factors are fixed while she adds some other factor to it, the variable factor. And so if on the other hand, Helen was able to expand both the amount of the factory and equipment available along with the workers, then she wouldn't have to have diminishing returns or diminishing marginal product. But typically, when we're analyzing output from a firm, and you'll hear this come up over and over again, we're talking about short run production functions. By short run means that we have at least one factor of production that is fixed and that can't be varied. So, yeah, we see diminishing marginal product, but we see it almost always because we're looking at a short run production scenario. We'll talk about long run a little bit later, but long run means you can vary all of the inputs. Okay, so now we're going to be interested in shifting from production functions to cost curves, which are looking at the relationship that comes from having inputs that you're paying for to produce output. But instead of looking at the number of inputs themselves, we're going to be looking at how much the company is spending, or their cost that they're spending on the inputs, and showing, and there's a chain here, right? I spend money to hire a worker, and the worker produces output. But what we're doing is we're cutting out that middle part, so you don't see the worker anymore. You're just spending money to produce output. And that's the cost curve relationship. So over here again, this is our table that has all of our information. And now we're interested in the relationship between the second column, which is the output, and the last column, which is the total cost. So if we graph that relationship, then we can see the total output, the quantity of output we're producing, and we can see the costs that the firm is paying to produce that output. And that's our total cost curve. Okay. Now, it turns out when we're going to analyze how it is a firm can manage its costs to maximize its profits, how it can minimize its costs so it can be a successful company, there's the relationships between the fixed costs and the variable costs become important. Notice that a fixed cost, by definition, are costs that do not change with the quantity of output produced. So they have to do with these fixed factors of production in the short run, like the factory. In the short run, Helen's got this factory that she's using to produce her cookies, and she's paying rent or a mortgage payment on it. And whether she produces no cookies or she produces 1,000 cookies, she's still going to have that one factory, and she's still going to have to pay that mortgage payment or pay that rent. So if you're trying to think of fixed costs, think of things like rent. Also, another good fixed cost is insurance, right? Almost all companies have to pay for insurance for their equipment, or in case of a fire that's going to burn down their factory. And again, regardless of whether they produce 1 unit of output or 100 units of output, their insurance costs are the same. But then there are these other costs, the variable costs, that do vary with quantity of output, and those are associated with the variable factors of production, like the amount of material you use. Obviously, in Helen's case, as she makes more cookies, she's going to have to use more flour and more sugar and more workers. Those are all variable costs. So just to make sure, and there's a lot of abbreviations that are going to be thrown your direction, but we're going to use these abbreviations for total fixed costs. Sometimes people just use FC, but right now we're going to use TFC. And total variable costs, again, sometimes you'll just see VC. And the relationship between the total costs, or that you're adding the fixed costs and the variable costs together in order to get the total cost. So now we can look at another example, and this is based on a lemonade stand. And you can see here's fixed costs in the second column and variable costs in the third column. You add them together and you get the first column, which is the total cost. And then, or the first cost column. The very first column gives us the level of output. So we can say, okay, 1 glass of lemonade per hour is going to cost $3.30. 2 glasses is going to cost the firm a total of $3.80. Now, These last 4 columns all introduce new cost terms that again are important for considering the firm's management decisions. Remember, what we want to do is say, okay, if firms are trying to maximize their profits and therefore minimize their costs, then how is it that these firms will behave? How much output will they decide to produce? And then ultimately, right, we want to see if we can uncover the supply relationship that shows as the price of the product goes up that a profit maximizing firm will decide to produce more of the good. But in order to analyze that um, connection between costs and output, it turns out that we have to begin to look at these other measures of cost. And so in particular, we're going to be interested in these averages, the average total cost, the average variable cost, and the average fixed cost. Now, the definitions we're going to give you pretty quickly, but I'll just go over them before we introduce them in the slides. The average costs are like costs per unit, right? So you'll notice if, for example, I'm looking at the average fixed costs and you see that it's for 2 units, it's $3, then if I take the fixed cost and divide it by the number of units, then I get $3 divided by 2 is $1.50. So what the average fixed cost is telling me is the fixed costs on a per unit of output basis are $1.50. And likewise for the average variable cost, you take the variable costs or the total variable cost, divide by the number of units, and you get the per unit variable costs. And likewise for the average total cost, you take the total cost of 380 and divide it by the number of units, which is 2, and you get $1.90 is your total cost on a per unit basis. The last column, again, we're going to talk about quite a lot. And it turns out that marginal costs are the primary driver of profitability in a firm. And we're going to uncover that relationship in a moment. But again, marginal is like additional, right? And so if you notice at 0, right, there are no variable costs, they're only fixed costs. And so the total costs are just those fixed costs, right? So fixed plus variable, 3 plus 0 is 3. So at that point in time, marginal is not defined because we're not producing anything. But if we move from 0 to 1, we've produced 1 additional unit and our total costs go from 3 to 330. And notice in the marginal cost column is the 30 cents. It cost us an additional 30 cents to go from 0 to 1. And going from 1 to 2 is costing an additional 50 cents. So that's the concept of marginal cost. Formally speaking, marginal cost is the change in total cost from changing output, okay? And you're going to see those relationships in just a minute. So here are the formulas or equations that define the average fixed cost, the average variable cost, and the average total cost. Again, it's just the respective cost measure divided by the quantity of output. And in shorthand, you can see it's VC divided by Q for average fixed cost, or FC divided by Q, excuse me, VC divided by Q for average variable cost, and TC divided by Q for average total cost. And Sarah, are you with us this morning? Sarah? No, Sarah Wolf. Okay. How about Nicole? Are you there? Nicole. Did I get somebody? I hear a mic clicking on.
Yeah, it takes me a long time kind of to get my mic working.
Practice makes perfect.
Yeah.
So did you understand what I was saying about all this stuff? Because I threw a lot of information out there pretty quickly, and I know you guys will have a chance to go over it later. But Are these cost concepts clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, your thumbs up. Everything's good. Okay. Well, how about this one? This is the next one. I told you marginal cost is the change. They say increase in total cost because it's going to be a positive change from producing an extra unit. Um, but so how much does it cost to produce an additional unit of output? That's the question that marginal cost answers. Is that clear?
Oh wait, let me get a picture of that. Sorry.
Okay.
No, I hit the other slide.
Oh, you mean what?
Yeah.
You mean this one?
No, that's good. That's good.
This one?
Never mind.
Which one?
I got it. Don't worry. I got it.
Okay. Well, so yeah, so marginal cost answers this question. How much does it cost to produce an additional unit of output? Is that clear? The next slide is probably the one that's most mysterious. So
Mm.
tell me what you think about this one. This is the formula or the equation. And you know, the thing that normally messes up students if you're not an engineering
Oh,
student.
the delta.
Yeah, the delta. Or do you what's your major?
Engineering.
Okay, so you're good, right?
Yeah.
By the way, I'll tell you, um, it's a pretty good idea. So this is a typical career path for an engineer. I think I told you my sister, has a PhD in mechanical engineering, material science. Um, but typically you'll become an engineer and then like a project manager and then your next degree for a lot of engineers is an MBA.
Yeah, for business of some sort. There's a pretty good night program in Northridge or Cal State LA if you want to
Well,
be in classes while working.
yeah, but yeah, so doing an MBA is your normally your next degree for a lot of engineers. Um, and again for project management purposes and things like that. But what that means is that it's a really good idea to minor in econ if you're going to be an engineering major, because and I could give you lots of advice about MBA programs. The one around here, and a lot of times you can get your employer to pay for it to go to, is USC's MBA program. It's nationally ranked, and there's a really big network of contacts in Southern California through USC's MBA program. So it can be a career changer. Most MBA programs aren't. But if you go to a competitive MBA program, in the first year, you have to take a managerial economics class. And if you've been an econ major, then you'll do really well in that class. And it helps because competitive MBA programs always rank their students, and they push recruitment for their top students. So like USC, if you're one of the top students at USC, you can get a really, really good job when you get out with that degree. Anyway, so but I'm glad you recognize the delta, and that's the reason why that engineers do so well in econ. We're kindred spirits. Um, I'll say one other thing on that, and that is like my dissertation committee chair. He got a PhD in a program at Stanford called, now listen to this, Engineering Economic Systems. So he didn't get a PhD in economics like you and I would think about it. It's not like my PhD in economics. His PhD was in Engineering Economic Systems, which is a different program and more directly related to engineering. Anyway, so that's what marginal cost is, and it's this. I spent time on it because this is a really important concept, and the little triangle there is the capital Greek letter delta, and it just means change in. So it's the change in total cost as you change output. Normally, you look at changes of just one unit at a time. So here we've taken the data from the example we were using with the lemonade stand, and we just put the total cost column and the marginal cost columns next to each other along with the quantity of output. So you can see that clearly, right, we're going from 0 to 1 unit and we're adding 30 cents of costs and the total cost column. So our marginal cost is 30 cents. We go from 1 to 2 units, we're going from 330 to 380. We add 50 cents of total costs, and likewise going from 2 to 3 units and so forth. So I guess I would say, Nicole, I know you had trouble turning on your mic, but just, this is just checking. So you feel comfortable with marginal cost now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So here we've graphed the total cost curve. One of the other things that you might notice is that since it's the change of total cost that's being measured by marginal cost, the marginal cost is the slope of the total cost curve. So you can see we start out at like a low slope, and then the slope gets steeper and steeper, which means that marginal costs are increasing. So on this graph, we're graphing the other 4 relationships: the marginal cost, the average total cost, the average variable cost, and the average fixed costs, all on the same graph. And actually, so versions of this graph, and I told you guys this last time when we looked at the reading from your textbook, these types of graphs are the ones that are most common to analyze. And so if you were wondering, should you pay attention? Yes, at this point in time, you should be paying attention. And so this diminishing marginal product forces this increasing marginal cost. And that's why marginal cost is rising, because the variable factors of production, they have the same cost, like same cost per worker to hire, but the workers are becoming less productive as you get more of them. So that means the per unit cost of output is going up. And that increasing marginal cost is a general feature that you'll see in most applications. Now, I want to point one other thing out, and I don't think I have a really good example, but you'll see some on Ignithium. Oh, actually, this is a good example here. Notice in this graph, marginal cost initially decreases and then it increases. And so when we're talking about diminishing returns and increasing marginal cost as being general features, it's important to point out that, like in the example with Hungry Helen, right, or the Thirsty Thelma's lemonade stand, initially they have capacity for additional workers, and in fact, hiring 2 or 3 workers might actually make output go up per worker, because you can coordinate, have one person cut the lemons and have somebody else squeeze them, and then have somebody else mix the water with the lemon juice. And so you can get this kind of like assembly line increase in productivity by just having workers coordinate. But eventually, it's always going to be the case that you run into this crowding problem once you get too many workers in your facility. And then from that point forward, you'll have increasing marginal costs. So you'll hear economists often say, oh, well, we assume diminishing returns and increasing marginal cost. But they know, again, it's kind of like jargon in the discipline. They know that that doesn't mean that it has to be the case at low levels of output that marginal costs immediately begin to increase. It just means that eventually diminishing returns are going to kick in. And for almost all production processes, when we want to analyze how those firms are dealing with costs and how they're managing their costs to become profitable, the section of output that's relevant is that section of the marginal cost curve where marginal costs are increasing. The initial section is where you have decreasing marginal cost, really doesn't matter for almost all applications, because the output's too low. right, for the firm to really be successfully managing its business at that point. So the other thing we talk about a lot, besides increasing marginal cost, is the general U shape of average costs, okay, and in particular average total costs. You'll notice average variable costs and average total costs tend to be U-shaped. They go down and then go up. And that takes a little bit of explaining. It's just like a mathematical feature of the way that the costs change in response to diminishing marginal productivity. But there is this really important idea. When the average total cost hits its minimum, that's the lowest cost per unit, given that the output's being produced to begin with. Obviously, you might reduce your cost by producing nothing. But given that you're going to produce, you can minimize the cost per unit at the minimum of the average total cost curve. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. There's a special amount of output to produce to minimize your average total cost. And we give that a label of efficient scale, because it turns out that in any given line of business, firms will be pushed by competition to produce at the efficient scale, because if they don't, then other firms will be able to come in and offer the good at a lower price. And so the efficient scale is a really important concept, and being able to recognize it. So here's the average total cost, and see it has kind of a U shape. It goes down and it goes up. And it turns out that, again, the shape of the average total cost curve is driven by what's going on with marginal costs. And in particular, because of this, in the background of the marginal costs is this diminishing marginal productivity. But graphically, the relationship is as follows. Whenever the marginal cost is less than the average total cost, then average total cost is going to be falling. And whenever the marginal cost is greater than the average total cost, then the average total cost is going to be rising. And if you put those two statements together, then you'll end up realizing that it has to be the case that the marginal cost curve intersects, okay, so crosses, it intersects the average total cost curve at the average total cost curve's minimum point at the efficient scale. So graphically and in tables and in exercises, we can identify the efficient scale of output for a firm by just noting where the marginal cost curve is equal to the average total cost curve. That's where they intersect. Okay. So we'll put this all together now. Here's our last example. We're going to graph all these things together. So again, we have quantities of output, total costs, fixed costs, variable costs, average fixed costs, average variable costs, average total cost, and marginal costs. And we're going to graph them all really quickly. So our total cost curve, in more realistic examples, it tends not to be linear. It tends to have this kind of S shape to it. Remember, because there are some fixed costs, the total costs at 0 are going to still be positive. And then if we graph the associated average and marginal cost curves, you'll get this relationship. Now, I want to tell you one other thing that's not well emphasized in this lecture, but it is true, and it's just because of the mathematical relationship between total costs and average and marginal costs. And let's see, Matthew Schroeder, are you there this morning? Matthew? Okay. How about Jonathan Shorter?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, John, I just want to be clear because I'm going to say something that's not well represented in the slides. So this graph, this type of graph is what you'll typically see on Ignithium in the homework. And, this is kind of like the money shot. This is the big graph for this section. So understanding it is really helpful. And so you see there's the U-shaped average total cost curve, and you see how marginal cost goes down, and then it's increasing everywhere after it, reaches its minimum point. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, but notice, so marginal cost is intersecting, or, mathematically it would be the case. It's intersecting the average total cost curve at the average total cost curve's minimum point. Can you see that?
Yes.
So that's the efficient scale of output. But what you might not know, and is sometimes important, is that the marginal cost curve also intersects the average variable cost at its minimum point. And can you kind of see that here in this graph?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something to note. This is the graph you want to understand, and you want to know that marginal cost intersects average total cost and average variable cost at their respective minimum points, because that's going to be important in a lot of things we're going to talk about with respect to how the firm is going to manage its cost to maximize its profit. And it's also going to be important in being able to answer questions on Ignithium. So if you understand what's going on in this graph, which I guess I'll ask you if you have any questions.
I mean, as I understand it, the marginal cost just intersects at the efficient scale of both the total cost and the variable cost.
Well, yeah, and though I'll tell you, the word efficient scale only applies to the quantity associated with the average total cost curve. So like in this example, it looks like, what do you think? The marginal cost intersects the average total cost at about what level of output?
7.
Yeah, it looks like around 7 to me. So 7 units worth of output is the efficient scale for this business. Which, like I said, it's going to have this implication in a little bit that if they decide to produce at something other than 7 units of output, then their costs are going to be too high for them to be competitive with other businesses in the same industry. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But where the marginal cost intersects the average variable cost, it looks like that's at about, what do you say? Like something like, I'll let you say. Like
5.5.
like 5.5 units. Yeah. That is not called an efficient scale. There's just one. And
Okay.
scale has to do with the size of the business. So we measure it in terms of the amount of output. So scale of operation is your, like, I mean, if I told you like it was a large scale operation, you would probably have in mind, right? They're producing tons of output, right? And a small scale operation is small amounts of output, right? That kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The only difference here is that we're being more precise. So scale is a specific amount of output. So in this case, the efficient scale is like about 7 units. Okay.
I
Good.
have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've been in an economics class before, so I'm trying to like see if like I understand like the topics from before. But
Yeah.
like,
So did you take macro or did you take micro? Is this your second time through micro or what?
it was in high school, so I don't know. I'm not sure. It's just like a mix of both, but like the marginal returns are just going to be like the average total cost minus the marginal cost.
Well, okay. So kind of like good, but a little bit confusing question for me. So I would be surprised, so economics now in high school is mandated by law, but you know that the people that teach it, there's a lot of variation in the quality in what they teach because there's not a standard curriculum, and most times the instructors don't have any more training than you do by the time you get finished with this class.
Mhm.
A lot of times they're like, we're history majors in college, and they got assigned to teach econ because they had like one econ class in college.
Uh-huh.
So, but so I guess the thing that confused me about your question was returns. So what do you mean? Can you kind of drill down on that? Because here we're talking about marginal cost. Marginal costs are increasing, and average total costs have that U shape. They go down and then go back up. So you were saying the difference in returns. I'm not sure what you meant by that.
In my class, like they didn't like teach us marginal costs and like average total costs. They just taught us about like marginal returns.
Oh, 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 oh.
Marginal returns like were zero, then that was like the maximum. And so like as I understand it, like since the marginal cost, when that intersects the average total cost, that's the maximum, right?
Yeah. So I guess the thing is, well, actually it's a minimum where marginal cost intersects average total cost curve. It's the minimum of the average total cost. When we talk about returns, and honestly, this is between me and you. I hate the word. A lot of times people talk about diminishing returns,
Uh-huh.
and it's not clear based on the context. So I like think it's much more precise and would prefer, and I'm not saying it's not like common language in certain textbooks and things like that, um, to talk about returns, but I prefer to say things like diminishing marginal productivity. Then I know it's, you know, productivity on the margin is diminishing.
Mhm.
And then when I say diminishing returns to fixed factors of production, then I know I'm talking about returns in an output context. So when I say diminishing returns to fixed factors of production, I mean that as we um, add additional variable inputs to a fixed input, the amount of additional output, and that's what I mean by return, is the amount of output's going to go down. But a lot of times when people use the term returns in economics, it's not clear in what sense they mean it. Do they mean it with respect to output, or do they mean it with respect to something like, the returns to investment, which is a measure of the profitability of an investment, like the amount of dollars you're going to get back for each dollar you invest. So that's why it's hard for me to answer your question, because I wouldn't use the language in the same way that you
Mhm.
did.
That
But
makes-
but I would just emphasize, and this is one of the things that a lot of professors of economics get a little bit frustrated about, that the curriculum and training in high school is not more standardized, because it like spoils some students, meaning that they end up having ideas that don't really relate to the way that we would teach the discipline at the college level, and
Mhm.
then they get confused or they confuse us, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, the only thing that I see in this graph that reminds me at all of returns is the diminishing returns to fixed factors of production, and diminishing marginal productivity of, in this case, labor, which is causing the marginal costs curve to just increase. That's the only place that I see anything that relates to returns in the way that we would normally use it in college.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, okay, okay. Thanks for the
Sorry.
question.
for-
No, it's a great question, because if you have that question, there are probably 20 other people in class that have it too, but just didn't ask. A lot of times when I first start out in this class, in the introductory lecture, I talk a little bit about people that have taken this class in high school, and to just forget everything that they learned, because for the average student, that's the right way to go, because the classes are more like survey classes, and Okay, so here's our graph again. And so we have this U-shaped property that we want to talk about. And these 2 bullet points are the 2 main points, which is we get the efficient scale. Now, the last thing that we want to talk about a little bit is the difference between short and long run costs. Okay, so and this is the definition. I sometimes ask students, and I'm being coy, but I'll go back to you, Jonathan. You still with me?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, so think about this question. How long is the short run?
Shorter than the long run?
Exactly. That's the only thing you know, right? But it's funny because there are a lot of students, especially, and what's your major?
Mechanical engineering.
Okay, so okay, you don't have a lot of students from business, because they learn these concepts of short and long run. They'll say something like, "Oh, the short run is 2 quarters, it's 6 months," or they'll give me some other, time-based definition. And that might work over in accounting. That's fine. But in econ, there is no specific length of time. It's not 3 days, 3 months, 6 months. It just depends upon the flexibility that a particular type of business has with respect to changing the way it operates. So if some of the costs are fixed, and remember, fixed costs are associated with, you still with me, Jonathan?
Yeah.
They're associated with fixed inputs, like the factory. And if you have some fixed input, then you're inflexible in that period of time. You're like locked into a contract. You can't change. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And that means you're in a short run scenario. The long run is much more abstract. The long run is like a period of time, and it's longer than the short run by definition, but really depends upon your business. The long run is really kind of like a planning horizon where you could say, you know what, if I wanted to get out of this contract and I wanted to sell off that, asset, and I wanted to buy a whole new production line, in 5 years, I could design this whole thing exactly how I want it, with, more automation and fewer workers, or the opposite way, right?
Mhm.
Where really anything is possible in the long run. And so most scenarios in the real world are short run scenarios. It's only when you're in this kind of like long-term planning mode where you could really redesign everything that you're in a long run scenario. Is that clear?
Yeah. I'm like, in my head, I'm like imagining it, like, so if you like say like a given time period and like you're expanding the same amount over every time period, then like over time it'll kind of, your fixed costs will increase like linearly, but you could like graph that like through your plan, and so it wouldn't be fixed in the sense of like it's the same because of,
Well, yeah, and they only become fixed once you become committed, right? So
yeah.
if you say, well, my plan is to, and a lot of times when I talk about these things, and we're going to talk about this idea really quickly, which is constant returns to scale. And so this is a long run average total cost curve. And you notice there's this section as output varies where it's flat at the bottom.
Mhm.
And that section is what we would call the constant returns to scale section of the long run average total cost curve. So that's where you're doing kind of like what you were describing, which is you're replicating, right? I have 100 workers that work in specific ways in a factory of 10,000 square feet, and I produce, 500 units a day. And I can just replicate that by building exactly the same type of factory, hiring the exact same type of workers, using the same types of inputs, and I can just replicate it and do it again and again and again and again and again, and I can expand my output, and I won't drive up my average total cost because I'm just replicating things.
Yeah, you're just doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, right. But it again, it only becomes part of your long run average total costs or your long run costs once. Actually, let me take this back. It's only short run cost to be realized if you've committed in some way to it. If you're saying I'm planning on this strategy of expanding, but I could do it in a different way if I changed my mind tomorrow, then you're in a long run scenario because you have flexibility. You're in a short run scenario if you've locked yourself in some way. So our long run average total cost curve, notice that you have one point that it shares in common with each of these. This is just an example of 3 different short run average total cost curves, all of which are U-shaped. And the idea here is, so suppose that you're going to have a small factory, meaning you're planning small scale production. And this is the best factory for you to use if you're planning a small number of units. And so that's the point where it's tangent to that one point on the average total cost curve. If you were planning for that level of output, there's no other factory size that would give you a lower average cost of production. And then if you're going to expand your output, again, you might do it in an entirely different way. You might make things more automated. And then if you're planning for a higher level of output, then that medium-sized factory, again, it has one point that's in common with the average total cost curve. And that's, if you were going to produce at that level, the medium factory would be the best factory instead, in the sense that it would minimize your cost per unit. And then you have this large factory version too, if you were planning on doing a higher level of output. But in between all of these factory sizes, right, there are a bunch of other potential factories that you could build. If you think of factory sizes being in terms of like square footage, right, you could build a couple more 100 square feet of factory, and they're potentially an infinite number. And the idea here is that each one of those factories is perfect for some level of output, in the sense that it would minimize your cost of production. And so what economists say is that the long run average total cost function is are you still with me, Jonathan? See if you like this language.
Yeah, I just keep muting my mic because I don't want to like.
Yeah, it's fine, but I'm going to ask you, this is special language we use. It's the lower envelope of all possible short run average total cost curves. Lower envelope.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting language, right?
Yeah.
And if you've had some advanced calculus classes, which I'm sure if you're doing engineering you have, there's a special theorem actually that's related, and it's the reason why economists use this language, called the envelope theorem. And it turns out that the envelope theorem will generate this sort of like envelope graph at the bottom of all of these different potential levels of output. Anyway, if you ever see the envelope theorem, just know at the end of the day, that's what's generating this relationship. But it's more of a trivia point for you. But yeah, okay. So did you have any questions about that?
The point that it intersects is the minimum of the short run, like, of each one, right?
Well, no. See, so that's really interesting too, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you notice, like, look at this. So on the medium factory, it's clearly the minimum of the short run, right? But for like the small factory, right? So what it's saying is at that point where it intersects the average total cost curve, and let's just see, it's not here on the graph like what the unit is, but it looks like if the medium one is at 1200, let's say that's at something like, like maybe 150 units of output, that black dot where the short run is tangent to the long run.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, that's like at 150 units, right? So what they're saying is and notice with that short run average total cost curve, it actually has a point on it that's lower, an efficient scale, right? That's bigger than the tangency point, right? So but all this analysis is saying is that if I was going to produce 150 units, I couldn't choose any other factory size to give me a lower cost on average than the small factory. It doesn't mean that that small factory doesn't have a lower cost, like in this case of producing a slightly higher amount of output, like maybe like at 160 units is actually its efficient scale. But notice if I was going to produce at 160 units, then there's another point on the long run average total cost curve. And what that tells me is there's some other factory size that actually can give me a lower cost than that small factory that I previously was considering building.
Oh, makes sense. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it's kind of trippy. I mean, like this, I think is probably one of the most subtle graphs and most difficult to explain for instructors and students in principles of microeconomics. Okay, so we have these three regions, and I talked about one of them before. One of them is called, economies of scale, diseconomies of scale, and then constant returns to scale. And we look at the long run average total cost curve, and we note that there's a section where average total cost in the long run is decreasing, and then it flattens. And the decreasing region means we're experiencing economies of scale. As we increase our size of our factories, as we increase the quantity we produce, we're actually lowering our average cost per unit. And I guess I'll since I was talking to you and we're running low on time, I'll say really quickly, Jonathan, this is you've heard about assembly line and Ford, right?
Yep.
This is exactly what Ford was exploiting. He was lowering the cost per unit by expanding production. But at some point in time, you bottom out, and then after that, eventually, if you expand the scale with every production process, you'll end up getting diseconomies at some point. So, and I'll leave it to you, and maybe next time we can talk about it, why every production process has diseconomies eventually. It's kind of a little bit of a trip to think about that. Okay. So any questions? I know I'm over time, so I won't say any more. Is everybody good? Okay. It was good chatting with you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.